It never stopped raining in Portland. It just changed its intensity, like a conductor controlling an orchestra of celestial drops. On such a chilly October morning, the Happy Baby private pediatric clinic on North Williams Avenue seemed especially cozy. Abigail Frost loved days like this, when the gray outside the window made the bright walls of her office even warmer, and the children's laughter in the hallway sounded especially sonorous. She adjusted her impeccably ironed white coat and glanced at the appointment schedule. The first patient was 6-year-old Jaden Moore, a routine checkup after a recent cold. Abigail remembered the lively little boy with freckles scattered across his nose like stars in the night sky. There was a knock at the door, and it wasn't the usual Mrs. Moore and her son, but a tall man holding her nephew's hand. His presence instantly changed the atmosphere in the small office, as if someone had increased gravity. Grayson Moore, as he introduced himself, apologized for his sister who couldn't bring her son because of an important appointment. "Dr. Frost, I hope that's not a problem?" His voice was deep and confident, like a man used to making decisions. Abigail noticed that his hands, despite the obviously expensive suit, were those of a man familiar with physical labor, strong, with barely visible callus marks. "Of course not, Mr. Moore. Jaden, how are you feeling?" Abigail shifted her attention to the boy, but with the corner of her eye she noticed how closely Grayson was watching her actions. She habitually began her examination, asking the child about school, friends, and favorite cartoons, a proven technique to help young patients relax. "You have an amazing rapport with children," Grayson remarked when the exam was over. There was a genuine admiration in his gaze that made Abigail's pulse quicken for some reason. She chalked it up to the morning coffee. As she wrote out the references, she learned that Grayson owned Moore Construction, a construction company specializing in renovating Portland's historic buildings. His passionate talk about his current project, the restoration of an old mansion in Laurelhurst, made her forget the time. Only a knock on the next patient's door brought them back to reality. Grayson showed up again a week later, ostensibly to show Jaden's test results. They talked much longer than necessary, and at the end of the visit he invited her to dinner. Abigail agreed, marveling at her own spontaneity. Their first date was at a small restaurant overlooking the Willamette River. Grayson talked about his passion for architecture and how important it was to preserve the city's history and its buildings. Abigail shared stories about her young patients and how she learned something new from her children every day. They discovered that they both loved old jazz records and classic film noir. The next months flew by like a day. Grayson showed her a new side of Portland, taking her to old buildings, telling their stories, sharing plans for renovations. Abigail saw the city through his eyes, as a living organism, constantly changing, but keeping the memory of the past in every brick. Their relationship had evolved rapidly but organically, as if they'd been walking toward each other all their lives. Grayson proposed on the roof of a building he had renovated, with a stunning view of Portland in the evening. He chose a vintage ring from the 20s with a small sapphire, exactly the kind of ring she dreamed of. The wedding was in April, when the city was drenched in cherry blossoms. The ceremony was private, with only close friends and family in attendance. Jaden proudly carried the rings, and Grayson's sister wept as she made a toast. They spent their honeymoon in Europe, studying the architecture of ancient cities. Abigail couldn't believe her happiness. After several failed relationships in the past, she had met a man who seemed to understand her perfectly. Grayson was reliable, attentive, passionate. He was supportive of her career and listened with interest to stories about her work. She admired his determination and ability to see beauty in seemingly hopeless ruins. As she fell asleep in their new home, a Victorian mansion Grayson had restored especially for them, Abigail thought she'd finally found her place in life. She couldn't have known that this feeling of absolute happiness wouldn't last long, and that rainy Portland would soon witness a tragedy that would change their lives forever. In the meantime, she simply enjoyed every moment, every touch, every glance from her husband, unaware that those same strong arms that held her so tenderly at night would one day become the instrument of a heinous crime. A year later, the rain still poured down on Portland, but they no longer seemed romantic to Abigail. Her and Grayson's mansion, despite its impeccable restoration, had become a special kind of silence, the kind of silence that comes between people when there's nothing else to talk about. Their breakfasts together had become a silent ritual, she with a cup of herbal tea and a medical journal, he with a clipboard full of blueprints and estimates. "Gonna be late tonight, honey. New project in the Pearl District." The phrase had become so familiar that Abigail had already learned to nod without looking up. She understood his busyness. Grayson's company had been awarded the contract to renovate the historic district, and the project was large and prestigious. But sometimes at night, lying in their huge mahogany bed, she found herself longing for the days when her husband would tell her about every detail of his work, lighting up like a child at the mention of old masonry or Victorian stained glass. Things had changed at the clinic too. Dr. Frost was now seeing adult patients too, at the request of her superiors. That's how Calvin Reed showed up in her office. He came in with a laceration on his palm, cut by a shard of glass while working on a new painting. Tall, gangly, with perpetually disheveled brown hair and attentive brown eyes, he seemed completely out of place in the sterile environment of the medical office. "You know, Dr. Frost, I was trying to draw rain," he said as she treated the wound. "Not just drops or puddles, but the very feel of Portland rain, the way it changes colors and blurs the boundaries of reality." His voice held the same passion for his work that she had once loved so much in her husband's voice. Abigail asked to see his work, and on her next visit, Calvin brought some photos of his paintings on his phone. His cityscapes were amazing. The familiar streets and buildings transformed by the play of light and shadow seemed like portals to a parallel reality. In one of the paintings, she recognized the building Grayson had restored, but in Calvin's version, it looked alive, breathing, almost human. Their conversations grew longer and longer, going far beyond medical consultations. Calvin talked about his travels through small towns in Oregon in search of inspiration, about how he'd once spent an entire night on the roof of an abandoned factory to catch a particular morning light. Abigail caught herself smiling at his stories in a way she hadn't in a long time. The first time they'd met outside the clinic had been by chance, at a small Starbucks coffee shop on the corner of North Mississippi. Abigail had run in for her customary latte, and Calvin was sitting by the window with a sketchbook. He waved at her, and she took a seat at his table, hesitating for a second. 2 hours flew by. They talked about art, medicine, philosophy, how the city was changing, losing its soul to the onslaught of glass high-rises. "You should see my studio," Calvin said as they said their goodbyes. "It's real there, not those glossy pictures on your phone." Abigail knew she should say no, but instead she heard her own voice say, "I wish I could." Calvin's studio was housed in an old industrial building on the outskirts of town. Huge floor-to-ceiling windows let in the northern light, perfect for painting. There were canvases everywhere, both finished and unfinished, paints cluttered on tables, and the floor was covered with splatters and splotches of every color of the rainbow. Even the air seemed different here, full of creativity and freedom. They began to meet every week, ostensibly to check on the healing of the wound. Calvin showed her his new works, taught her to distinguish shades and techniques, told her the stories behind each painting. Sometimes they were silent, looking out at the city through the studio's huge windows, and that silence was different alive, full of unspoken possibilities. Grayson, meanwhile, was coming home less and less often. His company had taken on another major project, and now he spent 12 to 14 hours a day in the office or on construction sites. When he did return, he smelled of construction dust and fatigue. They had almost stopped talking. There was nothing to talk about. Abigail had tried to take an interest in his projects, but now his stories about remodeling seemed as dry and lifeless as construction estimates. One evening, when Grayson was once again late for work, Calvin asked Abigail to pose for a portrait. "You have an amazing face," he said as he set up his easel. "There's some understatement in it, a mystery. It's as if you yourself don't know who you really are." She sat still for hours, watching him work. Quick, confident movements, completely immersed in the process. The studio was warm, smelling of paint and turpentine, with old jazz playing quietly somewhere in the background. Abigail felt strangely calm and anxious at the same time. When Calvin finished, she didn't immediately recognize herself in the portrait. The woman on the canvas was staring off into the distance, and there was a longing in her gaze for something unattainable that took Abigail's breath away. "Is that really me?" she asked in a whisper. Calvin stepped closer, his paint-stained fingers gingerly touching her cheek. "This is who you could be." Their first kiss had happened right then, slow, tentative, soaked with the smell of oil paint and guilt. Abigail pulled away first, muttered something about the late hour, and almost ran out of the studio. All the way home, she tried to convince herself that nothing had happened, that it was a momentary weakness, that she loved her husband. But the next week she came to the studio again, and the week after that, and another week after that. Each time promising herself that this was the last time, that after this she would end all contact with Calvin. Each time knowing she was lying to herself. Grayson didn't seem to notice. He was sinking deeper and deeper into his work, staying late more often, touching her less and less. Sometimes Abigail thought their marriage had turned into one of his restoration projects, a beautiful facade that hid the emptiness behind it. In his absence, she wandered long stretches of their large house, looking at the impeccably restored details of the interior, the moldings on the ceilings, the stained glass windows, the antique furniture. Everything was perfect. Everything was dead on. In Calvin's studio, amidst the chaos of colors and unfinished paintings, she felt alive. And then the anonymous calls to Grayson's phone began. Short beeps, silence in the receiver. Abigail noticed her husband frowning more and more as he stared at the phone screen, his fingers clenching into fists for no apparent reason. She convinced herself it was work-related, that he was just going through a rough patch. In their bedroom at night, she lay awake, listening to her husband's steady breathing and thinking about Calvin's paint-stained hands, his eyes as he looked at her through the canvas, the way he said her name, as if tasting it. She thought about her old life, proper, timed, predictable, about how one chance encounter could change everything. And the rains poured down, blurring the lines between truth and lies, between loyalty and betrayal, between love and obsession. None of them could have foreseen that these gray Portland skies would soon witness a tragedy that would change their lives forever. That those droplets flying from the sky would soon mix with blood. An envelope with no return address lay in the mailbox of the Moore's mansion, lost among the flyers and bills. Grayson had found it late one evening, returning from a construction site. Inside was a stack of photographs and a short note printed on a printer. "Your wife meets with the artist every Thursday at his studio, North Industrial District, Front Street." He spread the pictures out on his desk, the same desk he'd once designed their house on. Abigail entering the old brick building, Abigail at the huge studio window, Abigail in the arms of a tall man with disheveled hair. In the last picture, they were kissing, and his wife was smiling. The same smile he hadn't seen in months. Grayson didn't go to bed. He sat in his office all night, methodically going through Abigail's bank statements, her call history, her appointment calendar. Every Thursday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon was her lunch break. Every Thursday, her credit card recorded a coffee purchase at a small coffee shop near the listed address. The morning found him still there, at a table littered with evidence of betrayal. Abigail, who'd come down for breakfast, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. "Lingering at the clinic today," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Lots of patients." Grayson nodded, continuing to stir the long-cooled coffee. He watched her get ready. The familiar movements, the familiar smell of perfume, the slight rustle of her silk blouse. Every gesture, every sound was imprinted in his memory with painful clarity. He parked in his pickup truck in front of the artist's studio an hour before the supposed meeting. The rain drummed on the roof of the car, creating a monotonous rhythm that made his thoughts heavy and viscous. On the passenger seat was his old sledgehammer, the trusty tool he used to tear down old walls to build new ones. Abigail showed up at exactly 3. She took a quick look around and slipped into the entryway. Grayson waited 10 minutes, then picked up a sledgehammer and stepped out into the rain. The front door was unlocked. He climbed the stairs, counting the steps, listening for sounds upstairs. There was music coming from behind the studio door, the old jazz he and Abigail had once loved so much. Grayson pushed the door open. It was unlocked. The artist must have felt safe in his little world of paints and canvases. They didn't hear him enter. Calvin stood at his easel, Abigail sitting in an old armchair wrapped in a blanket. They were talking quietly about something, their voices blending with the music into some intimate melody. On one of the canvases, Grayson saw a portrait of his wife, the way she used to be, the one he'd lost. The first blow struck the easel, shattering the canvas and frame into splinters. Abigail screamed. Calvin lunged toward her, trying to cover her with his arms. The second blow came down on his head with a sickening crunch. Blood spatter stained the unfinished painting, turning the landscape into a nightmarish abstraction. Abigail didn't try to run away. She stood slumped against the wall, staring at her husband with eyes widened with horror. "Grayson," was all she managed to utter. Her last breath mingled with the sound of the rain outside the window. When it was over, he sat down in the chair where his wife had recently sat and closed his eyes. The sledgehammer slipped from his numb fingers and fell to the blood-stained floor with a thud. Jazz was still playing, serene and gentle, as if nothing had happened. The cleaning lady didn't find the bodies until later that evening. An elderly woman went up to the studio to wipe the windows and froze in the doorway, unable to believe her eyes. Among the scattered canvases, shattered frames, and pools of blood lay 3 figures, 2 lifeless and 1 breathing. Grayson didn't even look up when she screamed. The rain poured down, washing away the footprints on the sidewalk, blurring time, blurring the line between the past, where they had been happy, and the present, where their lives had become one of those tragedies they read about in the newspapers. Portland went on with its life, not noticing that a drama worthy of the darkest noir had just played out in one of its studios. The first police car arrived 7 minutes after the janitor's call. Others followed, their flashing lights painting the walls of the old building red and blue, creating a bizarre dance of light and shadow. Detectives Harper and Thornton climbed the stairs, not yet knowing that they were about to solve one of the most high-profile crimes in the city's history. Upstairs in the studio, among the broken paintings and shattered lives, the music was still playing. The last jazz track on the old record player, the last witness to love turned obsession and passion turned death. The envelope, without a return address, lay in the mailbox of the Moore's mansion, lost among the flyers and bills. Grayson found it late one evening, returning from a construction site. Inside was a stack of photographs and a short note printed on a printer. "Your wife meets with the artist every Thursday at his studio, North Industrial District, Front Street." He spread the pictures out on his desk, the same desk at which he'd once designed their home. Abigail entering the old brick building. Abigail at the huge studio window. Abigail in the arms of a tall man with disheveled hair. In the last picture, they were kissing, and his wife was smiling. The same smile he hadn't seen in months. Grayson didn't go to bed. He sat in his office all night, methodically going through Abigail's bank statements, her call history, her appointment calendar. Every Thursday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon was her lunch break. Every Thursday, her credit card recorded a coffee purchase at a small coffee shop near the listed address. The morning found him still there, at a table littered with evidence of betrayal. Abigail, who'd come down for breakfast, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. "Lingering at the clinic today," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Lots of patients." Grayson nodded, continuing to stir the long, cooled coffee. He watched her get ready, the familiar movements, the familiar smell of perfume, the slight rustle of her silk blouse. Every gesture, every sound was imprinted in his memory with painful clarity. He parked in his pickup truck in front of the artist's studio an hour before the supposed meeting. The rain drummed on the roof of the car, creating a monotonous rhythm that made his thoughts heavy and viscous. On the passenger seat was his old sledgehammer, the trusty tool he used to tear down old walls to build new ones. Abigail showed up at exactly 3. She took a quick look around and slipped into the entryway. Grayson waited 10 minutes, then picked up a sledgehammer and stepped out into the rain. The front door was unlocked. He climbed the stairs, counting the steps, listening for sounds upstairs. There was music coming from behind the studio door, the old jazz he and Abigail had once loved so much. Grayson pushed the door open. It was unlocked. The artist must have felt safe in his little world of paints and canvases. They didn't hear him enter. Calvin stood at his easel, Abigail sitting in an old armchair, wrapped in a blanket. They were talking quietly about something, their voices blending with the music into some intimate melody. On one of the canvases, Grayson saw a portrait of his wife, the way she used to be, the one he'd lost. The first blow struck the easel, shattering the canvas and frame into splinters. Abigail screamed. Calvin lunged toward her, trying to cover her with his arms. The second blow came down on his head with a sickening crunch. Blood spatter stained the unfinished painting, turning the landscape into a nightmarish abstraction. Abigail didn't try to run away. She stood slumped against the wall, staring at her husband with eyes widened with horror. "Grayson," was all she managed to utter. Her last breath mingled with the sound of the rain outside the window. When it was over, he sat down in the chair where his wife had recently sat and closed his eyes. The sledgehammer slipped from his numb fingers and fell to the blood-stained floor with a thud. Jazz was still playing, serene and gentle, as if nothing had happened. The cleaning lady didn't find the bodies until later that evening. An elderly woman went up to the studio to wipe the windows and froze in the doorway, unable to believe her eyes. Among the scattered canvases, shattered frames, and pools of blood lay 3 figures, 2 lifeless, and 1 breathing. Grayson didn't even look up when she screamed. The rain poured down, washing away the footprints on the sidewalk, blurring time, blurring the line between the past, where they had been happy, and the present, where their lives had become one of those tragedies they read about in the newspapers. Portland went on with its life, not noticing that a drama worthy of the darkest noir had just played out in one of its studios. The first police car arrived 7 minutes after the janitor's call. Others followed, their flashing lights painting the walls of the old building red and blue, creating a bizarre dance of light and shadow. Detectives Harper and Thornton climbed the stairs, not yet knowing that they were about to solve one of the most high-profile crimes in the city's history. Upstairs in the studio, among the broken paintings and shattered lives, the music was still playing the last jazz track on the old record player, the last witness to love turned obsession and passion turned death. Detective Sloane Harper had never gotten used to the smell of blood. 20 years in homicide hasn't dulled that peculiar nausea, rising to her throat upon entering a crime scene. The artist's studio, flooded with evening light through huge windows, was a chaotic tangle of colors, and not all of them were from tubes of oil paint. Reed Thornton, Harper's partner, squatted down next to the woman's body. "Look at her hands, Sloane. No signs of self-defense. She didn't resist." Harper walked slowly around the room, noting every detail, broken easel-spoiled canvases, blood splattered on the walls, folded into a bizarre pattern, the last piece of art in this studio. On the table by the window were 2 cups of unfinished coffee and a box of donuts from the Blue Unicorn Cafe. "Suspect?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Grayson Moore, husband of the first victim, was sitting in that chair over there when the first patrol car arrived. Didn't resist arrest. He's at the station now, waiting to be questioned. Harper walked over to the chair that still held the warmth of the killer's body. Nearby, an envelope of photographs lay on the floor, the very pictures that had led to the tragedy. "Someone really wanted him to know about the affair," she muttered. The next few days turned into a methodical assembling of a mosaic of fragments from other people's lives. The detectives started with the Happy Baby Clinic where Abigail worked. "She was an amazing doctor," recounted the head doctor, an older woman with tired eyes. "The kids adored her. You know, there are some people like that. It's like they radiate light. Abigail was just like that." "When did you notice a change in her behavior?" "After she started seeing adult patients. About 6 months ago. She became distracted, often taking extra breaks. I thought it was because of the increased workload." The nurses recalled the first time Calvin Reed showed up at the clinic with a cut hand. How Abigail had insisted on taking care of his case personally. How he brought her coffee and donuts when he came in for dressings. "She glowed around him," the young nurse admitted. "You know how it is when a person is in love? It's impossible to hide." The security cameras told their story. Thursdays, always Thursdays. Abigail, leaving the clinic at 3 in the afternoon. A short walk to the coffee shop, then the artist's studio. Sometimes she stayed for an hour, sometimes 2. Harper spent a sleepless night reviewing tapes. One showed Abigail and Calvin standing under the building's canopy, waiting out the rain. He was saying something. She was laughing with her head tilted back. They looked so alive, so carefree. The clue was in the medical records Abigail kept. Harper had discovered them while looking through Calvin Reed's visit history. In the margins of one of the pages were sketches, small drawings that gradually became more and more detailed. The artist had taught her how to draw right during the receptions. "Take a look at this." Harper held out the folder to Thornton. She documented their affair in the medical records. Christ, they weren't even trying to be discreet. Grayson Moore's interrogation was more difficult than they'd expected. He sat in the interrogation room, still in his blood-stained clothes, and methodically described every detail of the murder. His voice remained steady, as if he were reading out a construction estimate. "I got the envelope with the photos on Tuesday," he was saying. "I didn't believe it at first. Abigail. She was the perfect wife. We were happy, at least that's what I thought." "Why the sledgehammer?" Harper asked. "I'm a construction worker. It's my tool. I used it to tear down old walls and build new ones. It's funny, isn't it? I destroyed something old that day, too." They found a notebook in his pickup truck with notes of Abigail and Calvin's meeting times and locations. He'd been following them for days before the murder, making a schedule, taking notes. Everything was planned with the same care he used to plan his construction projects. A search of the Moores mansion revealed new details. They found dozens of photographs in Grayson's office, not just the ones in the anonymous envelope, but others he'd taken himself while under surveillance. Some showed Abigail alone, pensive, with a slight smile on her lips. Others showed her with Calvin, always in motion, always laughing. "You know what the worst part is?" Thornton said, looking at the pictures. "He loved her to the very end. Look at these pictures. He photographed her like he was trying to preserve every moment, even when he knew about the affair." In the bedroom, they found her diary, a small leather-bound notebook. The last entry was made on the morning of the day of the murder. "I have to tell him the truth, today. I can't live a lie anymore. Grayson deserves to know." Harper ran her hand across the page. The ink had yet to dry completely when Abigail closed the journal for the last time. The investigation had been going on for 2 weeks. They interviewed everyone, neighbors, co-workers, friends. The story of love and betrayal unfolded before them in every detail. No one saw the obvious until it was too late. The only question that remained was who had sent the photos. The answer was found in the coffee shop's security cameras. A young waitress with a crush on Grayson had been following Abigail for weeks. She admitted she didn't think about the consequences, just wanted him to know the truth. "Sometimes the truth kills," Harper said, closing the case. On her desk lay Abigail's last portrait, the one unfinished, blood-spattered. The artist had captured her eyes, a longing for something unattainable. And the rain in Portland came and went, washing away the traces of the crime, but not the memory of it. In the old studio on Front Street installed new windows, painted the walls, but local artists said that at night there are still sounds of jazz, the last melody of love, which ended so tragically. Harper often returned her thoughts to the case. The woman who sought happiness in all the wrong places. The man whose love had become an obsession. An artist whose paintings remained unfinished. 3 lives destroyed by one sledgehammer blow on a rainy Portland day. Grayson Moore's trial began in the midst of a Portland fall. The courtroom was filled with reporters and gawkers as the story of a love triangle that ended in a double murder captured the attention of the entire city. Harper sat in the front row, watching the defendant. In the months of his imprisonment, he'd grown gaunt, but his eyes were still the same, empty, as if frozen in time. A psychiatric evaluation revealed what the investigators had suspected from the beginning. Behind the mask of a successful businessman was a man obsessed with control. His testimony in court shocked even the jury. "I started noticing changes in her about a year ago," Grayson said in a steady voice. "Abigail has always been predictable, like a well-designed building, every detail in its place. And then something was disturbed. She became different. Wrong. He told me how he watched his wife, how he recorded her every move, every look. You know, precision is important in construction. The slightest deviation can cause the whole structure to collapse. I saw my marriage collapsing, and there was nothing I could do. But the real revelation was his words about the day of the murder. "I didn't plan to kill them," he confessed. "I wanted to fix it, like a crack in the foundation. I thought if I showed her the consequences of her choices, she'd understand. Come back. Go back to the way she was." Harper remembered the shattered canvases in the studio. Grayson had methodically destroyed not only the people, but every trace of their connection paintings, sketches, even the unfinished coffee in the cups, erased reality that didn't fit his ideas of what was right. At the last meeting, he asked to speak. What he said made the entire room freeze. "I loved her, every day of our marriage, even when I followed her, even when I took a sledgehammer to her, especially then, because in that moment, she was all mine again, just like she was in the beginning, only mine." The sentence was expected, life in prison without parole. Grayson listened to it with the same calmness with which he'd spoken about his crime. After the trial, Harper found an envelope in her mail. Inside was Abigail's last unfinished drawing, an inept sketch of a cityscape done under Calvin's direction. On the back in her handwriting was written, "Sometimes you have to tear down the old to build the new." She used the same words Grayson used to describe her work. It was bitterly ironic that they were both talking about destruction, but they had different meanings. For her, it was a path to freedom. For him, it was a way to maintain control. The Happy Baby Clinic has erected a plaque in Abigail's memory. Calvin's studio was bought by a city gallery. Now it hosts exhibitions of young artists, and the Moore's mansion stands empty, gradually decaying despite impeccable restoration. Harper sometimes drives past these places, past the clinic where Abigail started every morning, past the studio where she found freedom, past the house that became her beautiful prison, 3 dots on the city map, connected by lines of fate that led to tragedy. There were no unexpected twists or ulterior motives in the Grayson Moore case. It was a simple and terrifying story of love turned obsession, of control masquerading as care, of freedom at too high a price. The last entry in Grayson's interrogation report read, "I built the perfect house for her. Why wasn't that enough for her?" He never realized that a house, no matter how beautiful, could become a prison if it lacked freedom. That love turned into a cage ceases to be love. That some walls can't be rebuilt no matter how skillful you are with construction tools. And the Portland rain pours on, washing away the traces of the past, but not the memory of it. 3 lives destroyed with 1 sledgehammer blow. 3 stories woven into one. 1 city that holds their secrets under its ever-graying sky.